Welcome back to House Targaryen. We are going to do the scarlet coloring. This video is going to be done a little differently than the videos I've done before. I discovered that having done a lot of editing projects in the past, including a short film and actually working for the city of Minneapolis in their video department, it's a much better idea to edit things together in pieces rather than mash all the audio onto one track, which is what I was doing before. I was recording the coloring at the same time I was doing all the talking. The other thing I discovered is that it is actually very exhausting trying to recall the massive amount of lore and history that George Martin has written into A Song of Ice and Fire. And so now I've actually gone through and made some notes, and so it's going to make the process a little bit easier for me and a little less exhausting. So where I left off before was the Siege of Storm's End. House Durrandon had ruled the Stormlands since the Age of Heroes, and the final Storm King was named Argh Durrandon, who's also known as Argh the Arrogant. And rather than getting cooked alive in his castle like the Lord of Harrenhal, and who is the last king of the Riverlands, he decided to meet the Targaryen host in open field. And in the rain and the mud, he fought Orys Baratheon, Aegon Targaryen's friend. He wasn't king yet. Met him in open field and died, as he said he would, with a sword in his hand and a curse upon his lips. Argh daughter, Argella, barred the gates and said she would defend Storm's End to the last man. Her men, however, were not as eager to die as she was, and so they delivered Argella to Orys Baratheon, naked and chained. And it said that Orys took her, covered her with his cloak, unchained her, fed her soft words, and took her family's sigil, the crowned stag, black upon a golden field, for his own sigil. And that's why the House Baratheon has the black crowned stag upon a gold field, which is the same banner as House Durrandon. And he later would take the daughter of Argh for his wife. After the Stormlands fell, King Torrhen Stark had called his banners, and they marched south to meet the Targaryen host. Meanwhile, the two kings in the west, King Meryn IX of House Gardner and King Loren I of House Lannister, joined hosts together and marched east to meet the Targaryen threat to their kingdoms. Aegon's sisters joined up with him to meet the massive army, with only 1/5 of the strength of the army coming out of the west. And unlike Storm's End, the weather was fair, dry, and windy, and they met in wide open plains south of the Black Water in a field of wheat that was ripe for harvest. Now the western host, which was about 5 times, like I said, 5 times bigger than the smaller Targaryen host, charged the Targaryen forces, and Aegon was riding upon Balerion and swept down from the sky and blasted them with fire. His sisters, who were also in the battle, blazed the grass behind them. The host began to break as the horses freaked out from all the smoke and fire, and the riders were blinded. Those that tried to ride out of the fire were rained down with arrows from the Targaryen host. And it was known after as the Field of Fire, where more than 4,000 men died in the flames. King Meryn IX had brought his sons, grandsons, brothers, cousins, and other kin to the battle, all of whom died. There was one gardener who lingered for 3 days from his burns, but once he died, the House Gardener, the House of Gardener perished with him. And this is a little sad. I don't know why I think this is sad, but well, pencil sharpening action. House Gardener had actually existed in Westeros since the Age of Heroes, and they claim descendant from they claim descendant from Garth Greenhand, and that's where they get their banner from, a green hand upon a white field. There's many other families who claim descendant from Garth Greenhand, as he was basically the Johnny Appleseed of Westeros, except instead of planting apple trees everywhere, he planted children in women. And it's also, and I was thinking about this last night, it's also a little curious that King Meryn brought pretty much everyone in his family to the battle and didn't have what we would now call a designated survivor, just so the entire house didn't perish. So that was a bit short-sighted on his part. King Loren survived by riding through a firewall when he saw that the battle was lost, and he ended up getting captured the next day. He bent the knee to Aegon and true to Aegon's word, showing mercy to those who swore fealty to him, named him Lord Loren Lannister, and named him Warden of the West. By this time, King Torrhen had crossed the Neck with 30,000 Northmen, and Aegon brought his host north as well. Aegon had brought all the lords who had swore fealty north to meet him, and arrived with a host of about 45,000. King Torrhen had heard scouts, had sent scouts forward and received reports about the burning of Harrenhal, which at this time was still a smoldering ruin. And knowing that he could expect, knowing the fate that he could, expect to meet, he crossed the Trident and laid the crown of the kings of the north at Aegon's feet and bent the knee. Aegon named him the Warden, Lord Torrhen Stark, Warden of the North, but he would forever be known as the King who knelt. At this point, the three dragon riders, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys, all split off. Aegon turned south to Old Town. Visenya turned east to the Vale, and Rhaenys turned south to Dorne. Shara Arryn of the Vale had strengthened her forces at the Bloody Gate, and if you know anything about the Eyrie, it is a white marble castle that sits at the top of, it sits on the shoulder of the Giant's Lance, which is, I believe, the tallest mountain in Westeros. It's this massive, jutting mountain that pokes into the clouds and has never been taken by siege, mostly because it is too difficult to bring an army up there, as there are three gates, or way stations, known as Stone, Snow, and Sky. However, Visenya flew above them all and landed in the inner courtyard of the Eyrie. And Shara went out and found her son Ronald Arryn seated on her lap and asked if he could ride the dragon. With no harsh words or animosity spoken between the two mothers, Shara called for the three crowns of the Vale, one of them including the crown of the Falcon Knight, which had been in the Arryn family for thousands of years, and offered them up along with the swords of her garrison. King Ronald flew around the summit of the Giant's Lance 3 times and landed the Lord of the Eyrie and Warden of the East. In Dorne, Rhaenys flew over the Prince's Pass and landed in Vaith, only to find it empty. She then flew on to Illyrian, only to find that castle empty as well. Even Planky Town, a town at the mouth of the Green Blood River, which is basically made up of small boats, skiffs, rafts, and barges all tied together, was empty except for the very young and the very old. When Visenya flew south to Sunspear, she found Miria Martell, an 80-year-old, yellowing, balding woman who was known as the Yellow Toad of Dorne, waiting in an abandoned castle. She said she would not fight the Targaryens, but they would also not bow to them, quoting their house words, unbent, unbroken, unbowed. I probably have that. I may have those words not in the right order. With that, Visenya flew back to Dorne, flew back from Dorne, leaving it unconquered. When Aegon reached Old Town, the city's gates were open, with Lord Hightower waiting to submit. The High Septon had fasted in prayer for 7 days, and saw no choice but to submit to the Targaryen host. Old Town is the center of the faith where the High Septon lives, and it's generally considered one of the most pious cities in Westeros. And hearing the High Septon's advice, Lord Hightower relinquished his city to the Conqueror. 3 days later, in the Starry Sept of Old Town, the High Septon anointed Aegon with the 7 oils and crowned him, proclaiming him Aegon of House Targaryen, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. The greatest defeat of Aegon's reign was the First Dornish War. It was the attempt to knit the last piece of Westeros into his kingdom, which was Dorne, which they left. Visenya had left at the Yellow Toad's words. And this resulted in the death of his sister Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes, who was killed by a scorpion bolt in the eye. During the campaign, Orys Baratheon was captured in Dorne along with several bannermen, and when they returned, they were all lacking a sword hand. And throughout this war, the Dornish would yield up their seats, and then once the host was gone, they would rebel against those holding the castle and take it back. Aegon had received a letter from Dorne after Rhaenys had died. He clutched the letter so hard that his hand was bleeding, and afterwards he declared that they were done fighting Dorne. And no one knows what the contents of the letter were to this day. Aegon spent the remainder of his reign flying across the realm on an endless progress to the various lords who would host him. And I believe this was done to display Balerion to anyone who may choose to defy him, sort of as a way of kind of flexing his power, since he was the first Targaryen king, and his reign was largely built on fear. He died at the age of 64 in his solar on Dragonstone, describing the battles describing his battles at the painted table to his grandsons Aegon and Viserys. In Valyrian custom, he was burned in the courtyard, and the fire was set by his dragon Balerion the Black Dread. His son Aenys I succeeded him as king. There's not too much to say about Aenys. His reign was relatively short. Unlike his brother Maegor, he was not warrior-like and kind of seen as a weakling compared to Aegon the Conqueror. There were several rebellions that had sprung up during his reign, mostly during the start of his reign, and this was because the Targaryens really didn't have the roots down in Westeros yet, and people still remembered what life was like before Westeros had become one kingdom. And these rebellions were actually stamped out by his bannermen and advisors. Aenys himself was rather indecisive and really wanted to be liked by his subjects, so it was hard for him to kind of, be the forceful king he needed to be. He ended up marrying his Valyrian cousin, and because incestuous marriage was not the norm in Westeros, members of the faith decried the union. And I thought this was kind of interesting because they were largely silent on the matter regarding Aegon not only marrying one sister but having two wives, both of them sister. So it was kind of a double whammy that I think they remained silent just because they were scared of him and the power that he would wield on the back of Valyrian. His brother Maegor was betrothed to Lady Cerys of Hightower, as the union proposed to Aenys' first child, Rhaena, was decried by the High Septim. Later, Maegor would take a second wife, Alice of House Harroway, in secret, and the outcry from this second marriage from the public forced Aenys to exile his brother. When Aenys betrothed his son and daughter together, he received the nickname King Abomination. The Faith Militant, which are known as the Poor Fellows and the Warrior Sons, these are basically the soldier forces of the faith. The historical kind of precedents and similar to our history would be the Christian Crusaders during like the First Crusades and multiple crusades that happened after that in the Middle East. And so these forces, the Poor Fellows and Warrior Sons, started to gather their strength in King's Landing. And because the Targaryen rule was still fresh, the faith thought they could. Targaryens could be uprooted, and the realm could more or less go back to normal. Because of the Faith Militant, King Aenys became sick from indecision, suffering from what they literally, quote, loose bowels and stomach cramps. His stepmother, I don't know what this term means, Queen Dowager, she's known as Queen Dowager of Visenya, took over his care. And he did improve a little bit before collapsing when he found out that his children, who were visiting Craighall Castle, were besieged. And like his father 5 years earlier, he was burned in the courtyard of Dragonstone. Pretty much right after Aenys died, his mother, Maegor the Cruel's mother, Visenya, flew east to Pentos, where Maegor was still in exile, and flew him back to Dragonstone, where he was crowned with his father's Valyrian steel crown. Whereas Aenys had been crowned with a more ornate crown that actually had the 7 faces of the faith in there, which I think was a token of reconciliation to kind of say, like, the Targaryens respect the faith. But clearly it wasn't enough. Clearly the token wasn't enough. Maegor was actually the only Targaryen that I went back and read about in the book Fire and Blood, because Maegor is, if you're familiar with the show Metalocalypse, Maegor is basically a character from the show Metalocalypse. He was a brutal and sadistic Targaryen king, pretty much the worst one that they ever produced. I would say he was about as crazy as the Mad King, but he also had Balerion, so he was a bit more fearsome, and he was also way more violent. So I definitely wanted to kind of flesh out him a little bit more. The only person to oppose the coronation of Maegor was Grand Maester Gawain, who said that the crown should pass to Aenys' son, Aegon, who was the Prince of Dragonstone. Maegor said the crown belonged to the man with the strength to grab it, and immediately killed the maester. His reign was challenged by the Faith, and they decided to settle the matter with a trial by 7. And a trial by 7 is a melee fight where 7 warriors on one side fight 7 warriors on the other side, and the last person standing is the champion. And so there were 7 champions of the Faith, and Maegor, along with 6 champions who stood with him, fought. Everyone fell in battle, and it was Maegor and 2 other champions of the Faith. And as Maegor slew his last opponent, he was bashed in the head, and both of them fell. And when it was determined that Maegor was the sole survivor of the trial, he was declared the winner and the true king of Westeros. After the battle, he lingered in a coma for it's either 27 days, it's 27 or 28 days. I actually heard I heard he came out of a coma after 28 days, and I've also heard he came out after 30. Not important. Eventually he did wake up, and people cheered his recovery. But no sooner than he woke up, he immediately mounted Balerion and burned down the Sept of Remembrance, which is where hundreds of warrior sons had gathered in prayer that day. So the cheers quickly turned to horror when they realized what he was capable of. And the Faith militant would never have the same power they did before the burning of the Sept of Remembrance. And this begun Maegor's war against the Faith, which would last his entire reign. The first battle that took place happened at Stonebridge, where a host of ill-equipped members of the Faith were basically armed with farm tools, were mowed down by the well-equipped Targaryen forces, which included men in heavy armor and heavy weaponry. And the bridge was renamed Bitter Bridge after that battle. The host host of the Faith was led by a man named Wat the Hewer, and Maegor cut off all of his limbs and forced him to be kept alive to witness his next marriage. At this time, Prince Aegon was still sore about losing the crown to his uncle, and probably out of fear, people started to turn against him and weren't backing his claim to the throne, and he soon got the name Aegon the Uncrowned. At this time, Maegor ordered the building of Maegor's Holdfast at the Red Keep, which is a castle within a castle. And Maegor's Hold Keep is the building that is surrounded by a dry moat filled with 6-foot iron spikes that do show up a few times throughout the Targaryen reign. So the king and the faith were each gathering forces, both sides hoping to end each other. Maegor and his mother Visenya flew around the realm, burning down the pious lords that defied them. When they reached Old Town, the center of the faith, they found that the gates had been open and that old High Septim was now dead. In his place, they had elected a 90-year-old lickspittle to anoint Maegor the king of the Seven Kingdoms. The new High Septim also dissolved the Poor Fellows and the Warrior Sons, although members of each group would continue to roam the realm for a number of years. And while Maegor was in Old Town, his nephew Aegon raced to King's Landing to claim the dragon Quicksilver, which was his father's dragon, and also the crown. And at this time, with Prince Aegon, about 15,000 men of the Westerlands and the Riverlands joined in the rebellion against Maegor. Maegor found out about this and quickly showed up with Balerion, and since Balerion was a much larger dragon than Quicksilver, what became known as the Battle Above the God's Eye. Balerion ripped Quicksilver out of the sky, tearing his wing off and killing the dragon and rider both. And this is actually the first dragon fight to take place since the Doom of Valyria. Maegor had 5 different wives who were known as the Black Brides, but he was never able to conceive a child with any of them. When his first son was stillborn, he ordered all of the midwives killed. Knowing the fate that could befall her, Queen Alice conspired with Lord Harroway, and she actually slept with several men to try to get with child. Maegor had a very faithful wife in Tiana of the Tower, and she was a raven-haired Pentoshi woman, and some say a witch, and she was basically I would argue she's the Lady Macbeth of Westeros, and pretty much just as cruel and black-hearted as Maegor was. So Tiana of the Tower ratted out Queen Alice and Lord Harroway. Once this plot was discovered, Queen Alice and Lord Harroway, their families, Maegor had their families killed, and many of them who were thrown onto the iron spikes of the dry moat that surrounded Maegor's holdfast. So the spikes came into play pretty early, and Maegor's holdfast was built during his reign. So the dry moat was used pretty soon after it was constructed. Alice herself was tortured over a period of 2 weeks by Tiana, and Maegor was there to witness all of it. Maegor then marched on Harrenhal to kill every single Harroway, so he was definitely somebody who nursed a grudge. Queen Alyssa, who was Aenys' widow, escaped with her son Jaehaerys. The other son, Prince Viserys, was questioned about their whereabouts for 9 days before he died, and he was all of 15 at the time he died. The Red Keep, which had been started construction during Aegon's reign, was finally finished. When Maegor was having it built, there was a lot of secrets, tunnels and passages and trapdoors that he had installed into the keep. And once the building was finished, he threw a great feast where all the builders, masons, and architects were gathered. And for 3 days, they threw a really lavish party. And then at the end of 3 days, he had them all put to the sword so that they could never reveal the secrets within the Red Keep. This story is most likely borrowed from the story of Ivan the Terrible, who, after the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral, blinded the architect so that he couldn't make anything as beautiful. Although I looked up, this story may not have been true. After the Red Keep was finished, Maegor ordered the construction of the Dragon Pit, a great stable for dragons, and he ordered it built on the same hill where the Sept of Remembrance used to be, which was now burned to the ground. Unsurprisingly, he had trouble finding people to build it for him, so they ended up using builders from Essos to complete it. The poor fellows at this time were still roamed the land, but as outlaws, and they were led by a woman named Poxy Jane Poor. Maegor had hunted them down and burned Jane alive. Another one of his brides, Queen Jane of House Westerling, gave birth to an armless, legless stillborn with both male and female genitalia. Queen Jane did not survive long after that. And it's interesting to note that this stillborn was born without legs or arms, similar to how Wat the Hewer had his legs and arms cut off by Maegor the Cruel. There might have been some connection between the two. George Martin likes to put in stuff like that. So that's going to do it for part 1 of Scarlet Coloring, and I will finish up the reign of Maegor the Cruel in the next video.